Hey everyone, this is Simran, and you're listening to Fuck, Marry, Kill, the reproductive justice podcast where we fuck the unfuckable, marry the unmarryable, and kill the unkillable. Today I'm joined by Malia Becker from the Center for Biological Diversity, an environmental justice organization doing incredible work for endangered species. Thanks for being here, Malia.
Thanks, Simran. I'm so excited to be here.
So we're going to start with a game of Fuck, Marry, Kill. Do you know the premise?
I do.
Perfect. All right, let's get into it. Fuck, marry, kill the ozone layer, endangered frogs, and Greta Thunberg. And before you answer, she is 20. Everyone I ask this question to is like, isn't she a child? She is 20.
Wow. Okay. I was so excited to hear what these options were going to be. Okay. The ozone layer, endangered frogs, and Greta Thunberg. Wow. I think for the sake, this is going to sound so strange, for the sake of the frogs being endangered, I think we're going to fuck. And I'll marry Greta Thunberg. This is so hard. The ozone layer isn't doing a lot for us right now.
That's true. It's already kind of fucked.
It feels bad to kill the ozone layer. But I don't want to kill any of these options. So I think those are my final choices.
What do you mean by because they're endangered, you're going to fuck them?
Great question. I don't know. There's no real logic there, I'm gonna say. But maybe it will encourage, reproduction in general.
You said it with such confidence. I was like, I have no idea what you mean.
Honestly, three hard choices, I will say. That's a challenging one. I don't want to kill any of those. Yeah.
I asked somebody else this question recently, and they told me that they would fuck the ozone layer because there's already holes in the ozone layer, and they think that would just be an easily accessible, fuckable situation.
That's a solid answer. I can really see that.
I was like, y'all are nasty. So let's get into it. Can you start by just giving us an overview of what the Center for Biological Diversity does and kind of what your work there is?
Absolutely. So the Center for Biological Diversity, we're a national conservation organization, and we work through a combination of the law. We work in activism spaces and doing a lot of outreach and creative media, really to protect endangered species, protect all wildlife, and the wild places that they need to thrive. So that being said, I am neither a lawyer nor a scientist. I work much more on the education and outreach side of things. And my work particularly is at this intersection of health and human health and the environment. So kind of helping people draw these connections between what's good for wildlife, what's good for people, and kind of drawing links between the systems that exploit and abuse the natural world, the wildlife and the environment, and how those systems also exploit and harm the health of people. And as an organization as a whole, we, really think about these connections, think about the welfare of human beings as deeply linked to nature. So that is pretty woven throughout all of our work. But my particular work, I feel really lucky to work at this intersection. I get to talk to a lot of people, and I talk to a lot of students, so college students, high school students, high school teachers, and making these connections, which a lot of people, as soon as you bring up the intersection of sustainability and health, people often are saying, oh, of course, that makes complete sense. And they often are siloed. You go to a college campus, there's the campus health clinic, and it's often kind of off in its own little world, separated, from the sustainability office or from the environmental science programs. And so I just have a really fun time with talking to students in those different kind of sectors of campus and encouraging them to start conversations with each other, and to really advocate for reproductive health care on their campus, and to talk about it with their sustainability office as well. Um, so that's what a lot of my work looks like. And I also do quite a bit on the sort of consumption side of things as well. So addressing, particularly around the holidays, we have a Simplify the Holidays program. So looking at how our holidays have been sort of taken over by consumption and the buying and selling of things, and less have become in some ways less about what feels good to us, what we're celebrating, coming together, and marking traditions, marking the time that passes. So yeah, I get to do a lot of different things. I kind of think every day at my job looks a little bit different, and that's really a joy and a challenge as well, a fun challenge.
I was reading y'all's website the other day, and I really, really loved the way that you made that link between humanity and nature, and how like the common forces that oppress humans are also the same forces that are harming our natural world, and our well-being is deeply connected to the natural world. That really resonated with me, and I was thinking a lot about like the hands of capitalism and the hands of patriarchy, and just these ideas that are entirely based on domination and control, and how that simultaneously is impacting our world. Thinking about the abortion bans, thinking about maternal mortality rates, like all these things around domination and control, and how those are also so deeply connected to dominating the natural world. And being able to see those common threads, I think, has really opened up my world and my heart to the environmental justice cause. It was never something, like you were saying, it's so siloed, so it was never something that I was particularly connected to. And so being able to look at these forces of domination, of power, as controlling the natural world just as much as it's controlling us, and those fates being linked, has been really inspiring, and able to make the connections that I just think are so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about my own time in college. These experiences were really separate for me. I worked as a sexy trainer in school, so did peer-to-peer sex education in the dorms, and that was a really important and impactful experience for me. To be around people who were sex positive, to honestly gain access to information and education that I lacked in the earlier years of my life, and to engage in a lot of conversations around bodily autonomy. And that's exactly what you're saying, that this education piece and having spaces for reproductive justice, spaces for environmental justice, is the opposite of control. It's about freedom, about bodily autonomy, and yet that space, talking about sex education and reproductive justice, was so separate for me from the environmental activism that I did in college. And that was focused on fossil fuel divestment at my school. Those two spaces kind of felt like different worlds to me, and there were different people in them. We didn't necessarily interact. I didn't have conversations at the intersection of those until later on. And I think part of that was, for me as a white person, never experiencing environmental harm as a young person, prior to that time. And that's something that a lot of communities, and particularly communities of color, don't have the privilege to not experience environmental harm until, as late as I did in my life. And to not draw those connections between issues of the climate crisis, issues of environmental justice, and their health, the health of loved ones, and the health of your own community. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that a lot of these things that we're talking about are impacted by these same systems of abuse, exploitation, and really about control, and that there is such a connection between that. Those systems. You mentioned capitalism and patriarchy. Those are absolutely two that we talk about and kind of work on, or try to work on, try to wrap our head around their impact on a day-to-day basis, and that those have an impact both on our environment and on human health in really kind of interconnected, intertwined ways.
I love that your school called them sexy trainers. Like, was there a bikini round? Like, was it like a Miss Universe situation? How did you get this? Do you have to prove that your face is symmetrical before you are allowed to be a sexy trainer?
Absolutely not. It was really, you just kind of expressed interest in it. I had a job as a student health, I think it was like a health promotion student staff member. So worked, within our student health clinic on various like health promotion campaigns. And my particular position, I focused on like contraception access and sex education in general. And then, yeah, you could apply and become a sexy trainer. And it was really great. There was such a sweet group of people, and we actually hosted this fantastic event that I want to somehow rehost as post college as an adult now. We did a sexy storytelling event, and it was an annual thing where we put out a campus wide call for stories, art. Someone once did stand up comedy related to. There was always a theme. So one year I think we did like everything awkward, silly, and embarrassing about sex, and encourage people to submit stories, and then have an event where people actually stand up with a mic and share them. And it was so beautiful and so wonderful, and kind of rare. That's the other thing I think about my job, is that I get to talk about these things on a kind of day-to-day basis that are taboo in some spaces, or uncomfortable for people to talk about, or for us as a society to talk about. um, and sex is one of those. We don't really like learn how to talk and share about sex in a comfortable or welcoming or encouraging environment, and to really welcome like the full range of that experience, because absolutely, like, embarrassing moments, awkward moments are such a part of that, and the stories that we see on TV so rarely actually show that reality.
Yeah, they really don't. Like, and you're so right. Like, it sex is awkward. Being with people, and especially like when you're newer to it, like it's awkward and uncomfortable, and being able to share those stories, especially with young people who are maybe experiencing their bodies in that way for the first time, is so important. And if you do manage to get that event up and running, you let me know, because I got my fair share of awkward stories I'd love to tell an audience. Well, I really appreciate what you were talking about with the communities of color, specifically around environmental justice. And I want to talk to you about the kind of race and environmental justice intersection, because in my experience, environmental justice has always been really associated with white folks. And maybe that's just the spaces that I've been in. But when I was on campus and all of that, like, that was the students of color were often organizing around race, and then the people who were organizing around environment was more often white students. And I think that like my association with it is like the hippy dippy white person using non-aluminum deodorant, like that's just what I picture. And like and I wonder how much of that is like, when you're struggling to put food on the table, it's hard to think about climate change. And so, yeah, I'm curious to hear your perspective about that, because I know that it's both an untrue narrative that the environmental justice movement is associated with white folks, and it's also a harmful one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is such a complicated question because, you know, in my mind, environmental justice is very associated with communities of color. It's a movement that started really influenced by the civil rights movement out of the kind of the 1980s, and was, began to address environmental injustice and environmental racism, and to really, address the issue that exposure to environmental harm is unequally distributed. And that being said, I think that your experience is not an uncommon one. And that has a lot to do, I think, with sort of the mainstream environmental movement in general, and particularly at that time, was seen as this very white space. And at times, also committed a lot of acts of racism, was not necessarily a welcoming space for communities of color. And I think that has continued in some ways today. Um, and then I think it also does go back, you mentioned this, that it again kind of feels siloed, that the folks of color on campus are focused on organizing around racism, and that these other groups were organizing around the environment. And what's so unfortunate is that as we're talking about that, they're so connected. Like, we've been talking about patriarchy and capitalism, but I would add racism in there as one of these really huge, overarching, and at times really hard to face or think about on a personal level, or on a this is a change that we can make today, this is a change we can make tomorrow thing. But these are these overarching systems that impact our ability to live in the world, our ability to lead healthy lives, to have access to well-being. And these are all things that impact how we are affected by the climate crisis. So yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, and I think it is a complicated answer, because I think you're so right. It's not accurate to say that the environmental justice movement is a movement of white folks. That's the complete opposite is true. And it's incredibly harmful, because environmental injustice is something experienced by communities of color, and it is those communities who are at the forefront of facing that, and are at the forefront of fighting for justice and fighting for these mitigation, adaptation efforts to address climate change. So not only is it inaccurate, but it's incredibly harmful, because communities of color who already are not having their voices heard are again being hidden in their fights for justice. And I think it's particularly insidious when these impacts of environmental racism, of environmental injustice, is being felt by communities of color, and it benefits, those larger systems to not have their voices, their experiences shouted from the rooftops, or heard, or talked about, and widely understood. So it really benefits, the oil and gas companies. It benefits the mining companies, the industrial agriculture companies, who are doing the polluting, who are, putting out toxic chemicals, and not being honest or upfront about the impacts that will have on communities who live near those industries. And yeah, it really is an unfortunate kind of association, or lack of association there, because as we know, environmental harm is unequally distributed, and the people who are contributing the least to climate change are now often being the ones, most impacted, and that's global as well as national.
Can you speak more to that, just to the ways that environmental injustice, how it specifically impacts communities of color and why it's specifically impacting communities of color. And yeah, I'm thinking about what you're saying around how it's the people who are impacting the environment the least that are getting the brunt of the impact of environmental injustices. It's not the people who are flying the jet planes that are experiencing poor water quality. And I'm also thinking about I feel like with environmental justice, there can be more of this idea that like it's a more equal evil, like, oh, we're all on the same planet, and so if it's failing all of us. But we're not all living in the same environment. We're living in really distinctly different environments. And with the siloed work that you're speaking to, we were doing some work on Stop Cop City happening in Atlanta, and Cop City is this militarized police training facility that was being built in Atlanta, in the largest forest in Atlanta. And they were going to cut down the forest and build Cop City, and they still are trying to do that. And so the organizing around it was distinctly connected to race. Like, it's about police. We need to be talking about and ending the incarceration system, ending the police state that we are in, and ending a militarized police state that is practicing violent practices, and noting that the Israeli Defense Force was also going to be trained on that, or is also going to be trained on that facility. Like, there's so many intersections happening here. And then you add on that they're taking down a forest, and that will impact air quality and water quality for the communities around that forest, who are mostly Black communities. It's just so interesting to think about the ways that you can enter this conversation through any avenue. You can enter it through anti-policing, you enter it through environment, you can enter it through anti-racism, but we are all fighting the same battle.
Right. And what I, in my own experience, kind of have come to believe is that it really does. It's kind of that old adage that, we are much stronger together, all of these kind of cliches. But I don't think it's inaccurate. I think that there's a benefit to these, really wealthy companies, these multinational corporations who are benefiting from environmental harm, making money from that. And there's a benefit to them to have these issues be siloed, to have these issues seem like they're in really different places, and having different impacts on different people, and to keep all of us kind of disconnected, and all of us feeling lonely, lacking in community, and lacking in support, and really allyship there as well. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think another example that I think a lot about is here in the U.S. The Line 3 pipeline in northern Minnesota. So I went to school in Minnesota, and there was a proposed pipeline that would be a massive tar sands oil pipeline project that would run from the Alberta tar sands, so in Alberta, Canada, all the way through Minnesota to Superior, Wisconsin. So it was going to run through the headwaters of the Mississippi, across, Indigenous Anishinaabe treaty lands, and then underneath Lake Superior, massive lake, and home to so many people, but particularly lands that should be protected by these treaties that are the homeland of Indigenous peoples there, and places that have really pristine, beautiful wetlands, places that have wild rice fields. And the Line 3 pipeline was eventually built after significant community pushback. There was a lot of organizing, and really a lot of fantastic cross-community organizing efforts to stop this pipeline. But it was ultimately pushed through, and a large part of that was the cooperation of police forces in northern Minnesota, who use the same tactics that they use on Black and Brown folks, that they have perfected throughout the country. They used on organizers who were trying to protect the environment, trying to protect Indigenous sovereignty and treaty lands in northern Minnesota. And so you're absolutely right. All of these things are so connected. And I think another piece of that has always tied these things together, to come back to, the patriarchy aspect of this, the gender aspect, is when there are, huge projects like this. The construction of a pipeline that large is a huge project, and it brings in an influx of workers to do that work to northern Minnesota, which is a pretty rural, sparsely populated part of the state. And there are often kind of pop-up camps of primarily male construction workers. And the impact on Indigenous women and Two-Spirit Indigenous people is profound. There's a really large correlation between these kinds of industrial projects bringing men from outside the community in, and sexual violence, and the nationwide issue of missing and murdered Indigenous people. And that, to me, draws all of these things together, because there's this horrific damage to the landscape. The headwaters of the Mississippi, that is a river that feeds, waters thousands of people downstream. And when I lived in the Twin Cities, our professors would always say, they would joke, humans are what is it, like 98% water?
Is
I
it
don't know
that
if
much?
that's accurate, but I think it might be 70% water, but
I thought it was 70, but we're a lot of water. We're mostly water.
70% water. We're mostly water. And our professors would always say, oh, we're 70% water, so you're 70% of the Mississippi River. And they love to kind of draw that direct connection to the body. And you think about that, if the headwaters of the Mississippi are being damaged by the creation of this pipeline. And what we know about pipelines is that it's not an if they leak, it's not an if they break, they will. And the damage is extreme, all the way down. But to really focus on, the place where that pipeline is, and the damage to the people who have lived there for time immemorial, whose land is that is, and not in an ownership sense, but in a we have co-created our community with this land, is kind of hard to comprehend, and also necessarily is the bringing together of all of these different things, of environment, of the body, of what we're talking about with justice and health and well-being. So yeah, that's just another example there of environmental injustice, and really the fight to bring environmental justice to these spaces.
So when we're talking about environmental justice disproportionately impacting communities of color, what do you think the root of that is? Like, is it just that governments and the corporations don't care about these communities? Is it that they are too vulnerable to fight back? Like, what is it, more nefarious? Is it less nefarious? What do you think is the root of this impact?
Yeah, I do think it's a combination of things. One thing, I can point to when you talk about heat. So extreme heat is another way in which people, and particularly pregnant people, are impacted by the climate crisis. That's a form of environmental harm. And what we found is that Black pregnant people of color, have greater rates of heat-related hospitalization. And that is partly due to redlining practices, so racially discriminatory redlining practices. And the reason for that is that these neighborhoods that were formerly redlined have been found to reach higher temperatures when there is, an extreme heat event, and have fewer trees. So there's literally less shade and less tree coverage that would cool the neighborhood down. And so that is due to these policies that have been in place, that were in place decades ago, but their impact is still being felt today. So I do think a lot of it is from policies that had an impact on the physical landscape of our cities, of our built environment. And at the time, it was very explicitly racially discriminatory. And even if those policies have now changed or now been banned, the built environment that we have reflects those, and that is a reason for it. Um, and then on top of that, what you're saying, about resources, I do think that um, you know companies or mining companies um, are looking for places that are not going to have as much time, as many resources to fight back. It is a huge amount of energy and effort to fight, a mine, a proposed mine, or a proposed pipeline in your community. And to be able to have the time, the effort to know, the systems that could help you. I said I'm not a lawyer, and I frankly would have no idea how to, get a lawyer to help fight something were it to be placed in my backyard. But I know people who are lawyers, or I know people who have that experience, and that may not be true for all communities. And so even those kind of connections to people in positions of power, people who have the knowledge, who could help with fighting back. I do think that those are a part of it, or play a part as well.
Yeah, those make a lot of sense. And there's something very scary about the ways that decisions made God knows how long ago can impact us so long term. Like, it takes 5 seconds to cut down a tree. It takes many, many years to grow one back.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can you speak a little bit to how environmental justice relates to birthing outcomes and to raising children specifically?
Sure. Yeah. So there are a lot of connections there. I even mentioned extreme heat already, but the impact of heat on a pregnancy is pretty extreme. And even in these recent heat waves that we've been having in the last couple of years, that's been um, noticeable. I think the Bay Area had a pretty bad heat wave last year. Even here in Oregon, we've had some pretty noticeably different uh, temperatures in the summers. And extreme heat is very scary for a pregnancy. So extreme heat can increase the risk of a preterm birth from 8.6% to 21%. So
Wow.
a large leap. Yeah. Um, and then on top of that, here on the West Coast, we have quite a few wildfires, and we know that wildfire season is increasing in severity, and it's also increasing in length. And both pregnant people and children are particularly sensitive to air pollution from wildfire smoke. That also has an impact on um, a pregnancy, and the risk is higher for pregnant people who work outdoors. So uh, if you're thinking about agricultural workers, and if pregnant agricultural workers experience an exceptionally high exposure to those kinds of climate risks. And so when you think about that, abortion bans um, in the country disproportionately harm people of color due to that legacy of racism and what we're talking about with environmental harm, and with our built environment and its impact on our health. And then kind of the other piece, the other connection with environmental justice and birthing outcomes or raising children, uh, is the climate crisis itself. You know, part of reproductive justice is not only being able to choose if you want to have a child or if you don't want to have a child, but being able to raise your children in a healthy and safe environment. And as we, face the increasing instability of the climate crisis that is upon us, um, that becomes less and less possible for everyone, but particularly for those people in those communities that are at the forefront of these environmental harms. Um, so it becomes a question, and that's something I think a lot of young people have been talking about, or at least in the back of their heads might have as a kind of question or a concern, um, when we're facing so much uncertainty about the future and we're already experiencing so much instability, change in the climate. What does it look like to bring a child into the world? And do we feel comfortable doing so? And I think that's a question that um, is so important for people to think about, and also, it's kind of a hard one. I even just saying it out loud, I feel such a sense of kind of grief because it is a loss of reproductive justice in a lot of ways, and of that bodily autonomy that we were talking about, that freedom to think about the instability of our climate and say, like, oh, can I think of the future, and not just think of my own future, but think of the future of my children, and feel confident in and raising children, and raising them in a safe and healthy environment.
I really appreciate you bringing that up because we we have been having internal and external conversations about this a lot recently, and I have been thinking about this a lot recently because I've heard that narrative a lot. The idea that bringing children into a dying planet is undesirable or even unethical. And in my experience, I have heard that a decent amount from white communities. And I had a really interesting conversation recently with a Black person who was talking about how the reason why white people are feeling so scared to give birth or raise children in a dying planet is because this is their first crisis. And that for communities of color, we've been raising children in slavery, genocide, war, like through so many crisis zones. We've been raising children and birthing children and have made it work and have made incredible family structures, and even in the hardest of situations. And so to talk about the ethics of raising children in challenging situations kind of devalues the experiences of so many people and so much history of communities of color who were raising children through dire situations. But at the same time, the planet's dying. And how do you bring children into that? I don't know. And so I'd really am interested to hear your thoughts about kind of that nuanced conversation, and because both sides make me feel crazy.
Yeah, no, thank you. I really, really appreciate that perspective, and it's absolutely one that I have talked with people about and heard before. One of the Center for Biological Diversity's board members, actually, Serene Fox, is a Anishinaabe activist in Canada, and she talks a lot about this. That particularly for Indigenous communities, I think she says, the world has already ended for us. The world has ended before, and we are already in, post-apocalypse in some ways. The Anishinaabe people have experienced genocide, and are still experiencing that, are still living through that. And so, she talks about the joy of bringing her children into the world, and of that being a really kind of radical and revolutionary act for her. And we interviewed her as a part of a environmental health and reproductive health webinar series that absolutely everyone should listen to, because hearing her describe her experience is fantastic. And she's in conversation with a young white Canadian activist who talks about her experiences. And she is a part of a birth strike movement for the climate. And she speaks to that for white people, it is in a lot of instances this new fear, this new uncertain future that has not been, experienced by white people in the way it has by Black folks, by Indigenous folks, by people of color. And so you're absolutely right. And I think, as with anything, these decisions are so personal and are so related to our own histories, our experiences in the world, and all of the identities that we hold. And it's so, kind of, yes, I can absolutely, the climate crisis is something we've never seen before, and it's happening on this global scale in a way that feels kind of new and scary. And absolutely that's justified. And what you're saying, and that communities of color have experienced these kinds of, in that community, like absolutely global threats, absolutely, the world cannot go on after this. And yet it has, and yet people have, raised children, people have survived, people have created community and ways to move forward. And that's something, when I think about the future, that is so important to look back on, and to look at now. I mean, that's happening right now. And to know that in times of extreme crisis, in times of extreme violence, that people come together, people find ways to survive, people, create ways to have hope. And that there is a long, long legacy, a long history of doing that, and a lot of knowledge around that to listen to and to turn to now. And not to turn to a whole nother topic, but I think when we think about the future, I think there are a lot of people who have this kind of like tech optimism of, oh, we're going to develop this new technology and it's going to save the world. And for a lot of reasons that I'm very skeptical about that. One of which is that I don't want that, and I don't think it's accurate. I think we would do much better to kind of be reflecting, be looking at history, reflecting on when these large systems of oppression that we're talking about, patriarchy, racism, and capitalism, when they've inflicted harm on us in the past, how have we survived that? How have we come together? How have we gathered in community? And what can we learn from that going forward, rather than going for growth at all costs, going for this idea of endless growth, that if we keep going, if we keep producing, if we just say more, 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 somehow that's gonna, save us. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that hopefulness that you're bringing into it, because you're right. We have survived the end of the world before, and we will again, or you know what, maybe at some point we won't, but that's how it is. And I think that I totally agree with you about the tech future not being the future that I want to see, and this idea that progress for the sake of progress is a inherent good. Why, if the planet's dying, we don't need to build a spaceship that takes us to Mars. We need to engage with the planet again. Like, we need to sit down and rebuild our relationship to nature, rebuild our relationship to Earth, versus just technologying our way out of things. And we have this reproductive futurisms conversation that we do through Sister Song. And I had no idea what reproductive futurisms was until a couple months ago, but it was talking about a very similar thing, looking at the ways that the tech future is actually one that we should be skeptical of, and technology is built by humans and thus is inherently biased and is not actually necessarily the future that we want to be having. And that also there are a lot of technologies that are not a beep boop computer. Language is a technology. Eastern medicine is a technology. Western medicine, like all these ways that there are ancient technologies that we can be re-embracing, that we can be looking at to our ancestors, to the people who have survived crises before. And that has given me a lot of hope when thinking about the future, that it's not just about the more. It can be about taking a step back and reconnecting with the earth and with the people around us. So I'd love to talk about the population control narrative. I've heard that a few times in the context of the idea that technology, what is killing the environment is that there are too many people on it, and the solution to saving the environment is to have less people on it. And I've always just had the intersection of race and environmental my issues with justice. That, my thoughts on it, specifically around the fact that the people who are having and more babies about how oftentimes not the reason why the earth is dying is because there's causing the most carbon footprint that are causing the most environmental decay. And so what does it look like to be curious to hear your thoughts about it, and also how it is for the environmental issues when it's not the root of the problem, but at the same time I don't know enough about reproduction in that way. Love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad you asked this, because, when I think about reproductive justice, it's first and foremost about bodily autonomy. It's about freedom, and personal decisions. So anything about, population control, anything about control or coercion is really antithetical to reproductive justice. And quite frankly, we've been talking throughout about how autonomy, freedom, and kind of those systems of oppressions that impact our ability to have bodily autonomy are the same as the ones that impact environmental issues. So it's my belief that, you can't address any environmental issue with control or coercion. That's never the answer. And that form of control is an act of violence as well. And that being said, I appreciate you kind of also addressing the sort of blame, or mentioning this blame idea around population, because in my own work, talking about population does come up, and nothing about freedom, nothing about autonomy is going to be related to blame. Blame is never going to be like the answer. It's never going to be a useful way to talk about these things. And exactly like you said, there are individuals, there are, even the US as a whole, as a nation, is this high consumer, high wealth country compared to other countries in the world. And the same is true for, like you said, corporations who are polluting the most, who are contributing the most to climate change, are sort of let off the hook in some ways if you run with a narrative like that. But these things are really like combined, coming from an environmental organization. And looking, if you look at actually like wildlife and the spaces, the habitat loss, and things like that, you have to recognize that the number, how many people there are has an impact on the environment. It does have an impact on wildlife. And that impact is always, always combined with how much we consume, with how much we pollute, with all of these other things. We talked about endless growth earlier. This concept of endless growth, endless development, is a super harmful narrative for wildlife, and for people alike. That is not focusing on people's well-being, people's health. The health of people who are here now. And so, yeah, in my position, we kind of talk about these really nuanced issues, because there are a lot of different things to consider when you talk about these things. But what it really comes down to is that these environmental issues and reproductive justice are so connected, because they're impacted by those systems of oppression, by patriarchy, by racism, by capitalism. And so I believe the solutions are really interconnected. And that one of those solutions really, really is reproductive justice, environmental justice, and achieving bodily autonomy. So with a real focus on the freedom, and the ability to choose the option, having an education to be able to make those choices. And then exactly like what we were talking about earlier, like knowing our history and knowing what it means for you as an individual to have kids.
Yeah, I really appreciate the nuancedness of your take. Like, it's a nuanced problem. It requires nuanced solutions, and the control and population control specifically, but control in general cannot lead to liberation and cannot lead to freedom. Controlling our reproduction, controlling our bodies is not the solution. But at the same time, having a lot of people on the planet is harmful to the planet, but you're right, like it's incongruency with other things. And so being able to understand that piece is so important. And I feel like whenever I hear the population control thing, my brain just immediately goes to like the welfare queen myth, and just in the US, these conversations about like, oh, like, well, black people are having too many babies, black women are having too many babies, and like that's what's leading, it's like putting a strain on our government and on our social services. And so when I hear that and I hear the population control, I'm like, I get triggered. I get triggered that it's like a similar root of it. So it's helpful to see it from that perspective.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because I think that's so true. And it's so hard to be able to talk about these things in a nuanced and honest way, when there have been so many people who have used population control and used the environment as a reason to control people and to control people's bodily autonomy, and to espouse eugenics and espouse racist ideology. And it's so hard then to come back and say, well, we can have a discussion about these things that's absolutely separate from that control has no space here. And that's not something that is ever going to lead to well-being for our planet, for us. But we can have a discussion about the impacts of these things that really centers freedom, that centers justice, that centers the well-being and health of all of us here today.
Yeah, eugenics is exactly the word that comes to mind. Just like anything that has the potential to control specific groups' reproduction is just like one quick jump and a skip away from eugenics. So being able to put it in that context is so important. And I was in Uber once, and the Uber driver I was going back from a conference, a reproductive justice conference, and he was like, "Oh, what were you at?" And I told him about the conference, and he started going on about how his like Catholic parents had 11 kids and they couldn't take care of the 11 kids and it was terrible, yada yada yada. And he was like going on about how having too many kids is a problem in this country. And then he said, he's a white man. He said to me, it's because you people can't stop fucking. I was like, first off, anyone who says the word you people, we're done here. Second off, sorry you're not getting laid, bro. Third off, you're the one with 11 siblings. I don't have 11 siblings. You're the one who said you had 11 siblings. How am I the problem right now? It was so mind-blowing. And I think about that all the time with like, he genuinely like in earnest was like, oh, what's putting a strain on social services? What's putting a strain on our government? What's ruining this country is that Black and brown people can't stop fucking and having babies.
Wow. The audacity and the racism to say that straight to your face. Not that it would be better hidden. Wow.
It was mind-blowing. Yeah, it really gave me a look into like the inner world of like white America.
Right. Yeah, and it's so troubling because, if those ideas are continuing to spread with no interruption. This is something that I'm so passionate about, is that if we're so scared to talk about the nuances of population, if those people are just kind of like talking in an echo chamber of like, oh, the issue is Black and brown communities, and espousing really racist ideas, that completely leaves out, any sort of reality around consuming, around wealth, around inequity. And I mean, we're here to talk about environmental justice. It's leaving out environmental justice that Black and brown communities are the most impacted by the climate crisis, are the most impacted by environmental harm to begin with. And so I really, want to be able to get in there and have those conversations to say like, wow, I hear potentially that you care about the environment. Although, in that situation, who's really to say, because that sounds much more like, a control narrative and using the environment as kind of a scapegoat, almost like a way to just talk about control. Which has kind of ended up being the theme of this episode. But just the damage that does when the narrative is around control and not around bodily autonomy, and being able to get in there and have conversations about it, and really, get into the weeds in some ways about these nuances is so important.
Yeah, I have news for you. I think that every episode might be talking about control. I think that might be at the root of all of these topics. So I think it will keep coming up.
Yep.
So with the understanding that these larger systemic issues, these corporations are making 70% or whatever of the climate decay, of the environmental decay, with the understanding that there are these huge pieces and players in the environmental injustice world, how can individuals take accountability to the environment? Like in the world where we're like, okay, don't use plastic straws. Like plastic straws are bad, of course, but how can we like as an individual take accountability while also acknowledging the larger structures at play that are playing a much bigger role in the environmental decay?
Yeah, thank you. Wow, you set up that question perfectly, because plastic straws is such a good example to talk about this, because I think it can be really disempowering for people to hear about, something like recycling, something about, don't use plastic straws over and over again, because I think when we learn a little bit more about the recycling industry, or when we think about the impact, of one person not using a plastic straw, I think it can be disempowering. And I think that's done somewhat by choice. The concept of a carbon footprint in particular was put out there by a fossil fuel company to turn attention towards individual action. and particularly independent individual action. So these things that, you kind of have to make a choice on, and it's on you every day to do. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do those. I think those are absolutely important. But when I'm kind of an organizer at heart, and when I think about organizing, it's always in community. It's always talking with people. It's always sharing experiences and building power together based off of all of our different experiences. And the same is true of, the plastic straw kind of question, because when you go back a little bit further and you think about the plastics industry as a whole, plastic is made out of petroleum. It's made out of fossil fuels, and it is almost kind of a new life form for the oil and gas industry, for fossil fuel companies. And so when you kind of start to make those connections, you can say, okay, I'm thinking about, the use of single-use plastic, and I want to stop that, and really stop it at its source. And how can I take my care for the environment, and my desire to be protected from the harms of plastic? Because of course, plastic also has an impact on our health. And how can I join together with people and address this at the source, and really call out these industries for continuing to push single use, to push the use of plastic when we have so many alternatives, and so many, frankly, better ways of operating. So that's kind of one thing that I'll put there. And then another one, thinking about these larger systems, something we're really starting to dip our toes into as an organization, is talking about capitalism and talking about this idea of endless growth, and how can we make that an understandable and kind of actionable thing for people on the ground, everyday people, as well as environmental organizations, to start talking about and to start taking action on. So when we talk about endless growth, kind of waste reduction and our throwaway society and consumerism comes up, and these ideas that are really put forward by our capitalist system, by our economic system, are really at the forefront. So we're kind of dipping our toes into what are our opportunities for leaning into systems that we already have, that are already operating, that are much more about sharing, that are about cooperation and mutualism. So things like, the sharing economy. So like your buy nothing Facebook groups, like your free and for sale, libraries of things and tool libraries, which is a very similar idea to our traditional like public libraries where you can check out books. Tool libraries are a place where you could go to check out like a saw, or a hammer, a toolkit. There are also like kitchen chair libraries where you could check out like an apple cider press, or some of those like kind of bigger items that you might not want to buy yourself, but you can share them. And that means that one product gets a lot more use out of it. And at the same time, you're building community and you're building skills in sharing and in developing systems to share instead of to buy individually. So that's kind of, I went on a little bit of a tangent there, but that is what I think about when I think about how can individuals start acting on these larger systems.
Yes, I love that. I love hearing you talk about like the library system and the sharing system. I think about that all the time. Like libraries are kind of the coolest thing that we have in society, and there's no reason why we can't be doing libraries with so many other things. Like, why are we just doing it with books? And we could just do a whole episode on fast fashion. Like, just listening to you talk, I'm like, this environmental justice episode, we could be here all day, but I've already had you on long as fuck. So that'll be its own thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We're also dipping our toes into fast fashion. So more on that to come for sure.
So the last question that I have for you is, what advice would you give folks looking to rebuild their relationship with nature? And I just kind of wanted to bring it full circle to what we were talking about originally, about how human well-being is so intimately connected to the well-being of our natural world. So what would you say to folks who are really just looking to reconnect with nature?
I love that. Thank you. Yeah. I think, this is going to sound so corny and hippie, but really getting to spend any time outside that you can, whether that's, in a public park, even in your own neighborhood, and seeing what there is to see. Like, I'm such a big fan of bioregionalism, which is just like learning what's around you, like learning the plants, learning the animals, even things like paying attention to the weather. Now we have like our phone apps that tell us what the weather is going to be, but there's such joy in just like going for a walk and like looking at the clouds and saying, oh, like kind of that childlike joy that we used to have of like cloud watching and examining like moss on trees. That's really like my biggest recommendation for reconnecting there. Is there's so much that's all around us, and once you kind of start looking or start noticing, it can really become like a part of your life. So I live in Portland. We have really wonderful like city community of crows, and every day like at dawn and then in the evening, the crows like migrate across the city, so they all roost together in downtown Portland, and then they fly in the morning east, which is kind of where I live, and they like cross the sky all at once. And you think of crows and a lot of people are like, oh, they're not really that, you kind of see them everywhere, they're not really that spectacular. But the joy that I get just like seeing the crows cross the sky twice a day is like so wonderful. And I really cannot recommend it enough. Just having like even one thing, one species, one tree to kind of ground you in the space that you're in, is a really like connecting, grounding, beautiful way, I think, to start connecting back to nature.
That's so beautiful. We have a hawk's nest in our yard, in the tree in our yard, and the hawks and its babies have been shitting on my car every day, and I don't think I was appreciating it enough. I'm gonna start appreciating it more.
Yeah, that's a joy.
That's a joy. Oh, well, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. This was a wonderful conversation. I learned so much. I would say the most shocking thing I learned was that the carbon footprint was invented by fossil fuel companies. That truly shook me to my core.